was a young kid. We lived in southwest Philadelphia. I think I was about 4. I was sick. I woke up one night because I felt my bed moving. When I looked up, there was 4 shadowy people around my bed, rocking it. They had no faces, and they didn't look like they had clothes on. I don't know what the purpose of this was, but I wasn't scared. I just looked at them and went back to sleep. Another time, I was sitting on a landing and looked up the steps, and I saw 2 shadows running back and forth. It looked like they were playing tag. I was never afraid of these things. I didn't feel like they would hurt me, but when I would go up the steps by myself, I remember feeling like someone was watching me, but nothing ever happened to me. They weren't mean, as far as I could tell. I didn't realize they were ghosts until I was much older and didn't live in the house anymore. My mother grew up in the house. She had some experiences, but nothing she would ever really go into detail about. The only experience that I remember she would talk about was after her grandmother died. She died in the house. Her dog started going nuts in the middle room. He was looking at the middle of the room and jumping up and down. Maybe he saw my great-grandmother. I don't think she really believed in it. I know my uncle, who also grew up there, had some experiences. He told me once he was sleeping in my room, the middle room, when it got real cold, and he felt like something was in there with him, and he didn't know what. Sometimes, I still have dreams or nightmares about the house. I haven't lived in it for over 20 years. Pretty weird, huh? I don't know how many ghosts or spirits or what have you were in the house, but I'm sure there were many, and they were probably still there and still doing their thing. They just didn't seem to hurt or scare me. Maybe my great-grandmother kept them from hurting us. Who knows? My grandfather passed away last March, and I've long since been grieving his departure. After my grandfather died, my grandmother was left to live alone in her large house just outside of Irons, Michigan. My uncle and 2 cousins came up from Indiana to visit us for a week this past summer. My sister and I were staying at my grandmother's to help take care of my cousins. One night, we were having a bonfire in my grandmother's yard, which lies right on a lake. I, the only one sitting next to the fire, was thinking about my grandfather and all the things we used to do together. My grandmother and sister were sitting back on the patio, watching the fire from there, and talking to my cousins and uncle, who were in the house, behind a screen door playing video games. As if he were reading my mind, my cousin made a comment about my grandfather. "Will grandfather ever come back, Grandma?" he asked. The question sent a sharp pain through my heart. "No, Jimmy," answered my grandmother. "Grandpa is always with us. Even though you can't see him, he's here in spirit." Of course, my cousin didn't understand this, being only 4 years old, so he continued with the questions, then quieted and continued to play his video game. I sat still, staring at the warm fire, remembering the times I'd look at my grandfather and see him smiling at the blazing warmth. Just then, I got a strange feeling, an urge to look over at the flag, towering high over me in the fire. It was completely calm. There was no wind, not even enough to slightly blow a small leaf resting upon the ground. As I looked up at the flag, I remember when my grandfather would come out every morning and raise the flag to the top of the flagpole and salute it, smiling as he did so. He was so patriotic. He loved his country and fought as hard as he could for it while he was in the army during World War II. I gazed at the beautiful red, white, and blue colors of our country's flag as it lay impaling, hugging the flagpole. Just then, the flag rose and spread out completely straight. My heart jumped as I knew there was no wind to make this happen. I heard my grandmother mutter, "Thank you, Carrie." I looked back at her and she just smiled. Later I learned that my grandmother had said a prayer to my grandfather. She had said, "Carrie, if you are here with us, if you are protecting over these children, please give me a sign." That was when she saw as I had. The flag that he loved so much spread out straight. From that moment on, I knew that my grandfather was standing with me, protecting me, and I know, to this day, he still is. One of my older brothers, Tim, was born with a veil over his face. According to the old wives' tales, this means he would be able to see things that others couldn't. This was proven one April night in 1986. Being the youngest of 7 and only 18, I still lived at home when my mother got ill. My oldest sister Penny and Tim had come down to our house because they were concerned about my mom being sick. Well, the night Penny arrived, we all sat around laughing and having a good time. We all then decided to watch a movie. It was called Nightmare on Elm Street. About halfway through the movie, Tim said, "Isn't someone going to answer the door?" Since he likes to pull jokes, we all laughed at him and said, "I sure bet it's Freddy Krueger." But he was very adamant that there was someone knocking at the door. We all looked out the window, and there was nobody there. "It's a woman with shoulder-length hair, wearing a black dress. She's right there on the steps." Tim kept insisting, and finally he got up and went outside. When he came back in, he said he couldn't find her, and she must have left. We didn't think twice about it until the next day. My mother got worse, so my dad and Penny took her to the hospital, which was 60 miles away. Since he likes to pull jokes, we all laughed at him and said, "I sure bet it's Freddy Krueger." But he was very adamant that there was someone knocking at the door. We all looked out the window, and there was nobody there. "It's a woman with shoulder-length hair, wearing a black dress. She's right there on the steps." Tim kept insisting, and he finally got up and went outside. When he came back in, he said he couldn't find her, and she must have left. We didn't think twice about it until the next day. My mother got worse, so my dad and Penny took her to the hospital, which was 60 miles away. About 2 hours after they left, Penny, who has shoulder-length hair, called us and said to come right away, that her dad had collapsed in the ER. Tim and I get ready to leave, but before we could, Penny called to say our dad was having a heart attack. So Tim and I got in our cars and raced down there. When we got there, Penny met us at the door and told our dad was dead, and they had already taken him to the morgue. Being in shock, we didn't connect Tim's sighting of the woman in black at the door with what was happening, but Tim's sightings weren't finished yet. About a month after my dad was buried, Tim and his wife had gone to the cemetery to check on the headstone that was supposed to have been placed that week. They were checking the headstone to make sure the information on it was correct. Tim said to his wife, "Look, there's a man dressed like Dad sitting up there on that bench." My dad had been a farmer, so he always wore overalls and a straw hat if he was working outside. At first they didn't think anything of it, because the town where my dad is buried is a farming community, so there's a lot of people dressed that way. Then the man started walking towards them, but no matter how close they got, they could never even see his face, even though the hat wasn't covering it. Then Tim started to think it was Dad, so he walked towards the man and said, "Dad?" The man turned around and started walking away, and they couldn't even catch him, even though the man only walked and they ran. He finally disappeared at the edge of the cemetery, which was nothing but a line of trees on the edge of a creek with a plant, a factory, a few hundred yards behind that. When Tim told us about the man in the graveyard, everyone thought he was just missing my dad, until I pointed out that there are no benches anywhere in that cemetery. I once had a very scary experience that will haunt me for life. It was Super Bowl 96, and my family and I were at a party at my cousin's house. My cousin has a graveyard in the back of her house. She had just moved in and was telling us about stuff that had happened to her since she had moved in. We decided to explore the graveyard that night. In the graveyard, there was a church, an old abandoned church. We figured they kept the families in there who had died. We got a flashlight to look in the windows. We were looking around in the windows when suddenly my cousin gasped and looked up. We all looked up, and in the top window was a pale face looking down at us. She was so pale and sickly, her hair was dangling over her eyes. She was faded, but we could see her. When we saw her, we bolted. We screamed all the way back to the house. After a while, we were brave enough to go back to see what happened. When we got there, the doors that were boarded up and vined were totally open. We ran back and never went back there again. And if you don't believe me, don't, because I know it is true. There are some scary things that haunt us that we will never understand, and this is definitely one of them. I'm young, but have had my run of bad luck. When I was 8, Two of my dearest friends were shot minutes after I had left the woods. Sandy, Claire, and I were in the woods in the summer. We had fallen asleep in the treehouse when all of a sudden, I was woken up by a noise. Sandy turned to me in her sleep and told me to run away as fast as I could. I was shocked and did not want to leave, but then she screamed at me. I took off running into the woods. I stopped and turned around to hear two gunshots and screams. They had been shot in their sleep. 3 years later, I was talking on the phone with a friend, and I noticed my dog staring at the corner of the room, where I had a picture of my friends and I in the woods. I turned and saw a shadow in the window of a little girl. I told my friend about what I saw. I kept watching. It turned to me and said, run fast. My friend on the phone asked who was that. I turned off the phone and ran out of the house, just as a window was broken in the house by a man with a gun. I ran next door and I called the police. This may not be one of the more exciting tales that you've heard, but I assure you that it's true. My name is Lindsay and I am 16 years old. My best friend has claimed to be a psychic and has proven his ability several times. He enjoys freaking me out by reading my mind and knowing what I am doing while I talk to him on the phone. He told me that he used to have guardian ghosts when he was little that only appeared by his bedside when he was woken up by nightmares. However, as I do not know the whole story behind his ghost, I am writing about a different instance where his powers came in handy. One more note on him. He can astral project, meaning that he can send his presence places while his body is sitting comfortably at home. He has only done this with me once, when I was upset and crying while I was on the phone with him. Now for my experience. I was on the phone with my best friend, as usual. It was about midnight, and we had been having a very serious conversation. I was getting very upset, and was curled up on my bed with the phone. We had both been silent for about a minute, when I felt a presence in my room. I said, "You're here, aren't you?" Thinking that he projected himself into my room. He told me that it wasn't him. Suddenly, I was hit with a feeling of pure hatred and evil. Though I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, I knew exactly where the thing was. I huddled into the corner of my bed as I slowly became hysterical, saying, "There's something here. Get it out. It's here, and it's bad." He told me to block my mind and that he would help me. I kept saying, it's here, until he almost yelled at me. "No, it's not, Lindsay. It's here." I've never heard him say anything that angrily. We were silent again for about 2 or 3 minutes, until I worked up the courage to ask him what happened. He said that it was gone, that he had fought it off, whatever it was. We decided that our serious conversation had probably just opened up a window to some bad karma and had manifested itself in almost physical form. For the next few days, I avoided my room as much as possible. We decided to keep the serious conversations to a minimum for a while. I've had several experiences with entities, mostly I believe evil. They seem to be attracted to me. When I was about 5 to 8, my sister had a poster of E.T. that I was deathly afraid of. Its eyes would follow me, and I feel like I saw it wink. I think it might be a spirit working through it. When we moved from the house, I had the guts to rip it in half. Incidentally, my sister told me that last year she was deathly afraid of it too, but kept it because it scared me. Then when I was 10, I just turned out my nightlight and was starting to snuggle under the covers when I felt someone tickling the blankets around me. I was really sleepy at first, so I thought it was my mom, but the second I realized she went to bed hours ago, I flipped on my back and 2 disembodied hands started choking me. My spirit left my body. This is possible, and I ran down to my parents' room screaming to help me. When I realized I wasn't there, I was back in my bed. I was not dreaming because I had marks on my neck, and I remember the time exactly when I turned out my light. Then when I was 13 in my house, I now stay in one night, I was meditating, and when I was down, I went to blow out my candles and I looked out the window. I saw a short man all in black with glowing red eyes. I couldn't move, and I was petrified until finally I ran to the bathroom. Soon afterwards, I could feel a presence in the room, and I had horrible nightmares. I packed all my stuff up and moved to the empty room next door. I went back later and blessed the room in the name of my goddess and haven't felt it since. When I was 16, me and my friend, her boyfriend, and my boyfriend all went to this graveyard one night because if you went through this clearing, you can jump on top of the crypts and hang out. It was the boyfriend's idea. They were talking amongst themselves, and me and Tiffany were quiet when I heard a little girl's voice directly underneath say help me in a whisper. It kept on for a while, every couple of minutes, and kept getting louder. I noticed that every time it happened, Tiffany was looking around, and I asked her if she heard it. She said, yeah, it says help me. The guys never heard it. A little time after that, I was riding in a truck with friends, and a big swirl of fire leaped across the road. It almost looked like a tumbleweed the way it swirled. I wasn't on drugs or anything. Neither of my friends saw it. Then sometime this year, currently 19, I was riding along with a friend when I looked out the window and I saw this thing running along the side of the road. I thought it was a large black dog, and I watched as it moved ahead of the car and then darted in front. I screamed watch out, but it disappeared. My friend thought I was crazy. It wasn't just a shadow because I saw four legs moving, but if it was the ghost of a dog, it was a huge one. It was almost the size of a baby deer. Following this last encounter, I decided it was time to seek counsel from someone more familiar with the paranormal in an effort to make sense out of what was happening to myself and my family. I was fortunate enough to have become friends with a fellow service member whose wife had worked for a time at the Whaley House in Southern California. After relating to him some of the details of our ordeal, he assured me that she too had experienced encounters with the paranormal and would be most interested in hearing what I had to say. I made arrangements to meet with her at her earliest convenience. Cheryl was a very warm, gregarious woman and put me at ease immediately. She encouraged me to be open and honest about everything that I experienced and convinced me that she would believe everything I had to say. She had always been sensitive herself, she said, was well versed in the use and interpretation of tarot cards, and had participated in a great number of successful seance and Ouija sessions. I began my tale. After I'd finished, Cheryl immediately suggested that she and my wife and I make arrangements to meet the following weekend for a Ouija session at our apartment. She advised me not to purchase a board when I told her we did not own one. She claimed that they were dangerous and that she would create a disposable one when she arrived. As I left her, I was both anxious and apprehensive awaiting the weekend. The following Saturday evening, Cheryl arrived as planned, and she immediately asked for a tablet of paper, a felt tip marker, and a roll of adhesive tape. She proceeded to create a Ouija board, fashioning it out of individual squares of paper and taping them to our kitchen tabletop. She then asked if we had a wine glass, which we gave her, and this she placed upside down in the middle of her unique creation. She instructed us to lightly place 2 fingers on each of the bottom of the inverted wine glass, and shortly after we did as she instructed, she began asking questions to our spirit. The results were immediate and amazing. The wine glass became animated and moved so swiftly that we literally could not keep our fingers upon it. It initially traveled just inside the perimeter of the board in ever-increasing circles. As Cheryl asked questions, it would spell out the answers and then continued on its frenzied journey as before. Judging from the answers we received during the course of our questioning, we all surmised that our ghost was actually my guardian spirit and had been with me since birth. She was, according to the answers we received, responsible for every paranormal experience I and my mother had ever witnessed. Her name was Rachel, but she indicated that she preferred that everyone other than myself referred to her as Z. When my wife, during the course of our questioning, addressed Z by her given name, my guardian spirit became highly agitated as the wine glass suddenly shot out from beneath our fingers and struck my wife in the collarbone. Cheryl suggested that we immediately terminate the interview at that point. She proceeded to remove all of the paper squares used to create our makeshift board from the table and burned them in our kitchen sink. Following this, she took the wine glass we had been using as a planchet and poured a liquid into it that she had gotten from a container in her purse. She mumbled something, drank the liquid from the glass, washed it in the sink, and returned it to my wife. Cheryl then sat down with us and explained that in her estimation, Rachel evidently considered me to be her property, so to speak, and was extremely jealous of any female that challenged her authority in that regard. She stated that Rachel was very empathetic to my emotional state, and would tend to display more often while I was ill or at ease, or in a state of emotional distress or confusion. She suggested that my wife's and my recent reconciliation, following a brief separation, and my upcoming release from the service, were likely contributing factors to the frequency and intensity of our recent experiences with her. She was somewhat concerned, she said, about Rachel's blatant hostility towards my wife, but felt that as our lives returned to normal, Rachel would follow suit. She was right for the most part, until shortly after we moved. Following my release from the service, we returned back to the Midwest and lived for a brief period of time with my in-laws. During this time, my wife gave birth to our youngest son, and our experiences with Rachel became nothing more than unbidden recurring memory. By May of 1977, I was gainfully employed again, and by the following month, we were able to secure a townhouse which we leased for a year. Shortly after arrival in our new home, Rachel decided it was time to become reacquainted. She began innocently enough. Initially, the TV just began changing channels by itself again. Then we noticed that the water taps would shut off by themselves as we washed dishes, bathed, or showered. Usually it was the hot water that would be slowly extinguished, leaving us to wash in the icy cold water. Unless, that is, Rachel was upset with us for some reason. Then it was the cold water, scalding us until we realized what was happening and could defeat our efforts. The faucet knobs would be visibly turned to the right and be shut off. It took us a while to notice this, but we eventually did. We became accustomed to keeping an eye on the faucets so we could thwart her attacks. I should stress here that while I say we, and I did witness many of these occurrences, I was not subject to them personally. When I say we, I mean my wife and extended family or friends that came to visit us. I should also note that Rachel never harmed or attempted to frighten the kids. I did, however, feel the effects of the furnace when it began turning on by itself during the summer months and the air conditioning turning on in the winter. It got to the point where my wife and I trained ourselves to subconsciously listen for almost a click of the thermostat control, so we could react quickly and accordingly. As odd as it sounds, these daily interruptions to our lives became almost commonplace and second nature until they were brought to our attention, sometimes hysterically, by our house guests. At which point we attempted, as rationally as we could considering the circumstances, to explain the phenomena. We were for the most part able to assuage their fears. That is until my friend Dave spent the night. Dave was a lifelong friend of mine who called me unexpectedly one cold wintry night and explained that he had been physically evicted from his apartment by his wife, under threat of death should he attempt to remain, he claimed. He desperately needed a place to stay until she calmed down and became rational, so I, of course, invited him over immediately. He arrived at our townhouse shortly thereafter, carrying a sleeping bag and an overnight case containing what little he was able to stuff into it as his wife chased him around their apartment. He filled me in on all the juicy details of the latest arguments, and then, reluctantly, I was forced to bid him goodnight as it was getting late and I had to get up for work very early the following morning. He was settled in a sleeping bag on the living room couch, watching TV as I headed upstairs to bed. I didn't see Dave for a very long time after that. When I awoke the following morning and headed downstairs for my coffee and car keys, I immediately noticed that while Dave's sleeping bag, shirt, and shoes were still lying on the floor where he had left them the preceding night, he and his pants were nowhere to be found. Somewhat alarmed, I immediately went to the kitchen window, looked out into the parking lot, and noticed that his car was also gone. Had his wife called him at her house and begged him to come home, with the phone in our bedroom, we would have surely been awakened by its ringing, and Dave had assured me that his wife had no idea where he had gone. Had he called her perhaps? If so, why then hadn't he dressed before he left? Especially considering an extreme cold and with a foot of snow on the ground, there had to be a reasonable explanation, or so I hoped. Returning home from work that night, I immediately attempted to contact Dave by telephone at his apartment. The operator informed me that his line had been temporarily disconnected. I later learned that it had been ripped from the wall during he and his wife's argument. Growing more concerned, I then called his brother and was relieved to hear that he had indeed returned home to his wife the previous night. The circumstances regarding his sudden, half-nude departure from our house, however, was going to be left for Dave to explain, but Dave made no effort to contact me at all. 2 weeks to the day later, I was finally able to contact Dave by telephone at his apartment. He assured me that he and his wife were doing fine again, and then oddly, asked if I would personally return or mail to him the belongings left at our house that night. I suggested that he stop by for them one evening and fill me in on the details surrounding his sudden departure, but he emphatically refused. In fact, he stated that he would never set foot again in our house if he had anything at all to say or do about it. I was extremely perplexed at this point, and it took me 2 months and a 12-pack of beer to finally pry the story out of him, during which time I held his possession hostage. It seems that shortly after I had gone to bed that night, Dave decided that he should also get some sleep. He told me that he'd gotten up from the couch and turned off the television and then slipped back into his sleeping bag. Almost immediately after he had settled in, facing the back of the couch, he said that someone tapped him on the shoulder. Assuming it was me, he turned over to face where he thought it would be standing and saw only the darkened living room. As my mother had years earlier, Dave said he came to the immediate conclusion that I was messing around with him and simply rolled over to go back to sleep. As soon as he did, he said, came the shoulder tapping once again. He claimed that he jumped up and turned on the lamp at the end of the couch, hoping to catch me as I ran to hide, and was surprised to find the living room once again empty. Somewhat unnerved, but again blaming me, he turned off the light, this time deciding to face the living room. The tapping now came from behind the couch. He ignored it. It came again. He again refused to acknowledge it. Suddenly, he said, one end of the couch, with him on it, was propelled approximately 3 feet into the air and dropped to the floor. He struggled out of the sleeping bag and bolted straight upstairs to where my family and I slept. He stood, he said, outside our bedroom doorway for almost 10 minutes, torn between awaking us or fleeing. After calming down, he decided to go to the bathroom and return to his sleeping bag, having rationalized that what he experienced could be attributed to that night's activities with his wife. He returned downstairs and headed for the half bath, located directly off of the kitchen. As he approached the bathroom doorway, he said that the bathroom light suddenly turned on by itself, and the door slammed shut directly in his face, missing him by only fractions of an inch. That was the final straw. He grabbed his pants from the floor near the end of the couch. He would have left them too, he said, had it not been for the fact that they held his car keys, and ran for the outside door. As he ran through the snow, struggling to get into his pants, he claimed that as he looked back, towards the apartment windows, the bathroom curtains parted and the light went out. Dave held true to his word and never returned to our apartment again. I delivered his belongings to him personally as he requested. This is not a personal experience, but that of a friend. Her mother had been recently divorced and decided to buy a cute little house for herself and her 2 daughters to live in. The house was that of an elderly lady who was confined to a wheelchair. Before they moved in, the place needed a good cleaning, and some of the carpets needed changing, most notably the one upstairs, which had been the woman's bedroom and where she painted with oil paints, because there had been a worn path from the wheels on her wheelchair through the upstairs room where the lady had spent most of her time. The girls took the upstairs room, and their mother was downstairs. In the beginning, my girlfriend would hear noises during the night, but would think it was either the house settling or her imagination. Then she started to smell paint for no apparent reason, with or without the windows open, breeze or no breeze, night or day. The sounds became more defined and would often happen often. She told me that it sounded as though someone was moving around her room. She would hear the squeak of wheels, and the smell of paint was so strong. I never had the impression of fear from her. She often joked and said it was her room before it was mine, and she has every right to be here. In the 3 years that they lived in the house, before they moved out of state, the carpet in her room had to be changed 3 times because the same worn marks had been there when they first bought the house. It kept coming back. When I was little, my family just moved into a house in Des Moines,
and the first night we stayed there, I had to sleep on the couch in the living room, with me being the oldest and all. Well, let's get on to the point. Here's what happened. I got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. I came back, and the last thing I saw was my covers and my pillow. I started to shut my eyes, but then I opened them up for some reason, because I got a really strange feeling that I couldn't describe. And I saw a man right in front of me. He almost looked like an Amish guy, and he had these weird green eyes, and he just stared and glared at me. It felt so demonic. It felt almost evil. I couldn't even sleep. After that, I just froze. Then I put my head under my covers and screamed, "Mom, Dad." Just before my parents rushed in to see what was the matter, the Amish guy looked me dead in the eye, and he said one thing. He said, "If you ever tell anybody this happened, then you're going to die." The thing was, he was telepathically communicating with me. He didn't say it from his mouth, but he said it through his mind. I'm not sure if that makes sense or anything, but that's just what I felt. That was probably the most scariest ghost story I could ever tell to anybody, so I hope you enjoyed it.
I stumbled across your website about ghost hauntings and thought my current story could be handy. Firstly, I live in a little town and village at one of the most southern parts in Australia, along the SC coast. I'm 21 years old, never touched a single bad drug in my life except alcohol, and have no family with mental illness in my bloodline. About 4 months ago, I was reading my book in bed, and the lights were on. My dog was on the bed with me. Suddenly, at approximately 11 p.m., I heard a clap at the end of my bed, and the room went sorta cold. Suddenly, I heard a breathing hovering at the end of my bed, like something was watching me. I saw the dog growling at it. I checked outside to see if anything was out the window. Nothing could explain this demonic-sounding breathing that grew louder and was getting slowly closer to me. As I was creeped out, I went on to my sister's room and was explaining what was happening when all of a sudden it was behind me, right next to my ear. It went into my sister's room, and this time it got extremely loud. She started crying and hiding under her boyfriend's arm. It stopped and went away. For the next week, I started to notice whenever I walked into different buildings, the power would fade in and out for a second. Everywhere I went. I put it down as coincidence until it just became too much of a coincidence. Also, at one point in this week, I swear I heard a demonic voice in the living room saying something I could not understand. I told it to leave. After a while, things stopped, and 2 months after the first incident, I was laying in bed one morning where suddenly I froze. I was trying to send a text message, and from what I recall, the writing changed. I was trying to read it, but my vision blurred, my body was shaking, and I could not speak. I definitely was not religious, but I was praying subconsciously. It was really intense. This lasted about 2 seconds, 2 months later, and it's up to today, on Monday. On Friday night, my mate stayed over. My dog was on my bed once again. I heard my dog growling at something, and based on past experiences, I decided to just roll the other way and sort of just block out everything. My mate, on the other hand, was scared to death, as he told me the next morning that a really bad presence was in the room. He said he just could feel it. It was suddenly cold, and he said breathing came from the hallway, got louder, and went into my bathroom, which is when the dog started to growl. It stuck around for about 2 minutes. My mate was too scared to move, and didn't even tell me it was happening. Last Sunday, possibly the most intense thing happened at around 4:30 a.m. I went to turn the DVD player off with the remote. I accidentally fell asleep with it on, and then rolled onto my left side. Out of nowhere, wind was rapidly blowing in the room. It was a harsh, freezing cold wind, blowing on my face as I was covered by my blanket. A very deep, dark, but clearer than usual voice echoed in my right ear. It was saying something in a totally foreign language I had never heard like before. I could not control my body at this time. I was frozen into my bed and could not speak. I was trying to recite a prayer that my mate's dad, who is a priest, told me to say if shit ever went down. I could only mumble it, and this time it snapped out, and I yelled the word God subconsciously. The room became so still, it was daunting. I like to consider myself to be very logical and usually skeptical. I never would have believed such stories in the past, but now that I've experienced it and have heard so many stories of my friends doing seances and stuff, I think it's legit. I do not believe this to be a human spirit. I actually believe it to be some form of bad spirit or a demon. I still am not a religious person. However, I now believe in the unseen. I hope to get some much needed sleep now. I've had slight hauntings all my life. Just little things that I'm sure mostly everyone has had happen to them. That is until my family moved into a home in De Pere, Wisconsin. The home is an area rich with history. It is supposedly where the last Dufresne was found. I've heard stories from other people whom lived in this area, and a lot of them have problems with their homes as well. Here is my story. We moved into the home when I was about 13 years old. At first, we loved the house and how big it was, but in the first few minutes of running through it, I could almost sense something was really odd about the house. It was just a spooky feeling that I had when entering some of the rooms. Our dog would freak out a lot and bark at imaginary things and would refuse to enter some rooms. Our friend would refuse to spend the night because they felt something evil in the home, and some claimed to see demons and shadow people. I came home to find my best friend sitting on my porch shaking and crying. She told me that she was in my bedroom and heard my mother's bedroom door slam shut. She went to investigate and found that there was no reason for the door to slam like it did. So, she opened the door and set a heavy clothes basket in between the door frame and the door itself. She left the area, only to hear the door slam shut 5 seconds later. She went back and found the clothes basket had been flung inside of the room. We also had an unusual fire that should have killed all of us, but for some reason, I woke up to discover its TVs would flip on and off by themselves also. Alarm clocks would never stop the correct time either. I almost felt like the house had a good and evil battle going on with it, and we were caught in the crossfire. My sister and her friends would hear moaning noises a lot too. We finally told her mother that we needed to move, and she did not put up a fight. The day we moved out, she confessed to us that when she was sleeping, she would wake up to a feeling like someone was sitting on her and strangling her. She even felt the fingers once. When we got to our new house, the neighbors came over to greet us. They asked where we had just moved from. We gave them the address, and they got all very pale and told us that they too had lived in the same house and asked us if we had any problems living there. We compared stories, and almost everything was the same. The home is almost always for sale or rent. It just seems nobody wants to stay in it for very long. I did meet the current owner once, and he told me he has had no problems with the home, but I'm sure that he either is not noticing, or maybe the demons have finally left. It just seems like every home I lived in has the same little type of hauntings with it, or I'm just sensitive to that kind of energy, which I could live without. I have many things I could post here, but some I'm not ready to share yet. Hello, my name is Tiffany, and I have some uncertainties maybe you can clear up for me. When I was 6 years of age, my father was killed in a car accident on his way to work. To this day, I strongly feel his spirit remains with me. For the record, I love my father dearly, still do, and miss him so much. In the spring of 1992, as a class project for our psychology class, we had to take notes that night of the dream we had, if one was had, and share it with the class the next day. I still to this day cannot decipher if what I had was a dream or a near-death experience. I dreamt I sat in this tunnel. It had all my favorite childhood memories within it. My stuffed bear, my ball, my favorite tricycle, etc. Also in that tunnel was my father, dressed in a white gown, sitting on a chair. I knelt down next to him and listened to him tell me, "Tiffany, I love you, and I need you to understand this is not your time." I told him that I loved him and missed him so much, but he told me that I couldn't go, because then I couldn't tell my mom what he wanted me to share with her. He told me, "I understand you miss me, but you have to understand that one day we will all be together, and that time is not now.
You have to let your mother know how much I miss her and care about her, as well as the rest of you. I have 6 siblings. The light in this tunnel was absolutely beautiful. I've never seen anything like it before. As I was drifting away from him in the dream, I was waking up, sobbing uncontrollably. Of course, I had to go and share this with my mom, and she was speechless. Since then, I've only had one other dream with my dad and siblings in it. Of course, real as ever, and again, so upset I couldn't be with him. I'm just not so sure if the first one was an actual dream, out-of-body experience, or near-death experience. It was just amazing. My second experience, when I was 20 to 21, I became pregnant. I lived with my cousin and her boyfriend in Ballsville, New York, in an apartment on Downer Street. One night, while I was close to my expecting date, I woke up to a woman without a face in a white gown, almost like a nun sitting at the end of my bed. When I sat up, she immediately disappeared. She showed up a few times after, almost as though she was watching over me. It didn't matter if I moved my bed from one side of the room to the other, she still found her way. To this current day, I still feel like I have family who have passed on watching over me. I've been told I have an older man, usually sitting at my kitchen table with a cigarette in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, which sounds much like my grandfather. I can't tell you how many times my fiance, 2 older sons, and myself have put our cell phones, digital camera, flashlights, anything with batteries on the kitchen counter, and within hours, the batteries are almost drained. We don't place these items up there as often as we used to. Many times when family is going to pass on, see the individual in a dream the night before, and that's when I know their time has come. I've had dreams which include the dead met for other people, and let me tell you, they physically drain me. Oh my god, sometimes it's fun though. When relaying the message to the rightful person and seeing their expression when I tell them something I have previous knowledge of, and don't know what it means, but they have an understanding. It is just amazing. It seems to bring relief to them. I don't know if you can sort any of this out, or if any of this makes sense to you, but I know this stuff has happened to me, and it doesn't scare me. It seems like more of a wake-up call. Thank you for your time, and have a great evening. Thank you for listening as well. I sincerely appreciate it. My children and I had a very bad experience with the demon in a house that we lived in. My son became very scared one night as he viewed a ghost of a man with a sword sticking out of its side. This ghost was standing in the doorway of my son's bedroom very late one night. He said this thing was just giving him the feeling of such terrible dread and hatred. It made my son feel like it was going to kill us. My son started sleeping in my daughter's bedroom, and that thing started going from room to room, looking for my son, and so it started coming into our room and scaring the daylights out of me. I felt the hatred and anger. I know that it would have killed us if we had not gotten our pastor out there to help us. When our pastor pulled into our drive, he said he felt the anger and hatred just emanating from the house to the outside. He knew what we were up against, and we immediately started saying prayers to Jesus and his army of saints to fight for us. It ended up working so well that while we were living there, we had no more problems. But whenever we drive by, we cannot even look at the house. I know this was a short one, but I appreciate you listening. Hi, my name is Diane. Growing up in Detroit, my family lived in a house that was haunted. On several occasions, my whole family would hear loud crashes that could only be described as boxes of dishes being smashed. Everyone in my family experienced several ghost contacts in one form or another. On 3 different occasions with 3 different family members, a man about 60 was seen wearing a plaid flannel shirt. This man mainly stood there looking at the person, never attempted communication or harm. I was about 8 when he appeared, and I was the first one to see him. Although my sister, who was 7 years older than me, was not present. I tell this to you now, so later you will understand. My relatives from out of town were visiting, and the adults were sitting in the living room after dinner. I was extremely quiet in the hopes that only a child can have, that they would forget that I was there. I was sitting on the couch and the front door was open, with the screen door closed. I saw the man wearing a red plaid shirt, staying at the front door looking in. I told my family, and they thought I was overtired and put me to bed. Later that same week, my older sister was getting into the shower when she saw a man in a red plaid shirt standing in the bathroom with her. She freaked out and told my mother, who this time listened more closely. She then revealed that she too had seen the man in the red shirt standing in the kitchen by the sink, looking like he was getting a glass of water. All family members routinely heard footsteps throughout the house, especially going up the stairs into an attic bedroom. The steps would continue across the floor. All my family members experienced this together and separate on several different occasions. My sister's, whose bedroom it was for a while, admitted she was scared to sleep in that room and was frightened very often, thinking that someone was coming into her room. I later had that same bedroom and became so afraid of it that I began sleeping on the living room sofa. On several occasions, dishes in the house would break when put in a certain china cabinet, and on 2 separate occasions, a silver meat platter in the china cabinet, whose doors were kept closed, flew across the room at my mother. Lights turned off in the basement would be on when we would wake up every morning. The dryer would routinely come on by itself, and even after the electric was checked out, this still continued. The basement had an old coal room that had been converted into a storage room with paint cans and stuff. This room had a negative feeling, and no one in the family liked to even go in there. Likewise, no one in the family wanted to go under the stairs, although no one had a mysterious occurrence in those places. Every family member in that house had heard their name called on different occasions many times when they were home alone. One occasion comes to mind. My father, who was home alone, was working in the basement. My mother, sister, and I were out shopping at the mall. He distinctly heard the front door open, even though it was locked, and someone walked across the living room and the kitchen. He walked upstairs and found the front door locked, as he knew he would. It was then that someone called his name. He answered, and no one said anything after that. Another all-family experience came when we all went to visit my grandmother who lived across town. We even brought the family dog. We were returning home, and as we pulled into the driveway, I saw the drapes move back like someone was watching us return. I said, "Did you see that?" And my father countered, "What did you see?" I told him, and he and my mother and sister agreed that this is what they saw too. My dad went into the house first while we waited in the car. Everything was just as we left it with the doors locked. On one occasion, I awoke to having a woman staying at the foot of my bed. She disappeared as soon as I got a good look at her. Her name was Anne. She said she had lived in that house. No one in the house ever saw Anne again. This house had an addition that was a former dining room off the back. It had built-in china cabinets that would fly open on no occasion, even after my mother put hooks on them, thinking the wood was swelling. Music was often heard playing softly. In all, it was a weird place to live, and we were all very glad to move, but we did live there over 20 years. My parents moved into an apartment, as I did in a different location, while staying with them because I had become extremely ill. I had a unique experience of a ghost nurse who took care of me. My parents were asleep, and I was lying on the sofa, so hot but lucid. I could hear them snoring from the bedroom. I heard soft whispers shuffle across the floor and felt a cold hand lovingly touch my forehead, checking my fever, a comfort. I was not afraid really, and somehow thought Grandma is here, but I had no evidence of this. I remember keeping my eyes closed, just knowing my nurse did not want me to see her. I was very conscious of my parents snoring and knew it was not them. When the feet shuffled off, I opened my eyes and got up and looked at my parents. They were sound asleep. The whole situation lasted maybe 2 minutes, yet I started to improve that night. Hi, I don't have any pictures or sound files, but I just wanted to share my story, and maybe you can give me an idea of what on earth I saw. When I was 6, I shared a room with my older brother. He was fast asleep, but I couldn't resist. I remember tossing and turning. I had this toy closet with a short door on it. I looked at the door and saw a large hole in it. It was black, with no real shape, and had a hole in the middle of it, the only spot that wasn't black. Anyway, I get up and shake the curtains, trying to see if it was a shadow. I put my hand in front of it. I move my toys and dolls. What is making the shadow, I thought. I stood in front of it and just stared, and then moved off the door and just hovered in front of me. Now, this is where it sounds really stupid, but remember, I was only a kid. I asked if it wanted to play chess. I was frightened, but didn't know what else to do. I turned and ran and looked, seeing it coming from behind me. I look up at my door. My room had no door, just an opening, and there was a black shadowy figure, like the smaller one, but in the shape of a very, very tall man. He was blocking my way out, but I didn't care. I ran through him and into my parents' room, under their covers, and never peeked out. Years later, when I was around 14, my best friend spent the night with me in that same room, and told me she woke up around 5 a.m. to see a tall, shadowy man looking down at us in the darkness. She thought it was my father. My father never comes up into my room. He never has. I know this is real. I wasn't dreaming or just imagining things. Have you ever heard a story similar to this before about a black figure that changed shape? I've never seen them since, but I'm still curious. After reading some of the experience others have shared, I wanted to highlight a few of my own. I tend to be very observant of activity around me, whether I see it or not. Some people think it's an overactive imagination, but if they felt and saw some of the things I have, they would think otherwise. I guess my first experience would have to begin with what I consider my guardian angel. To start off, I lived in a fairly average house of 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, which was built in 1960. There were no previous owners. My room was at the end of a long hallway with my parents right next to it, quite convenient for late night toilets. When I was around 6 years old, I had my first experience with a world other than my own. I remember it so clearly. I'd been asleep and had a disturbing dream. I woke up, about to call for my mother. At the time, my bed was on the opposite wall of the door, and I could see my parents' room and most of the hallway. Before I called out what I saw, what I thought was my mother came into the room. I had a distinct feeling of peace immediately. I saw her clearly wearing her bathrobe with the blue and white stripe down the center and rollers in her hair. She walked into the room and up the length of my bed. When she reached the head of the bed, I put out my hand to her and felt nothing but cool air. She just looked down, smiled, and vanished. It did not frighten me that she was gone, just the opposite. I felt relieved and immediately fell asleep. The next morning, when I awoke, I saw my mother in the living room and noticed that she did not have any rollers in her hair. I asked if she had worn anything the night before, and she said no. I then asked if she had come into my room that night, and again, the answer was no. I did not say anything further in case she would say I was just dreaming. I knew then, as I do now, that I was not dreaming. It wasn't until a few years later that I told her when another strange thing happened to me as I lay in bed. I was about 15 at the time and still having trouble sleeping. My room had since been rearranged differently, with the head of my bed moved to the diagonal corner from my door, still viewing my parents' room. As I lay waiting for sleep to take me, I had the strangest feeling overcome me. This has happened twice since. I was laying on my side, staring at the opposite wall, when my vision began to tunnel. I felt my body begin to go numb and could hear, distinctly, my heartbeat slow. At first I thought I was slowly falling asleep, until I realized that I was very much awake. I was still staring at the wall, and I could make out my hand laying in front of me. I tried to move but could not. I tried to call out and could not. I thought I was dying. I could still hear my heart slow and was watching as my eyesight dimmed. Just before all that went black, I heard a distinct voice, which I thought was my mother, call my name. I heard it several times before my body and mind were together again. As soon as I could move, I sat up to see if my mother was in the room. She was not. I then went into my parents' room where both were sound asleep. I was extremely perplexed and exhausted after the ordeal. The next morning, I told my mother about the night before and about the time I was 6. She told me that it must have been my guardian angel, coming in a form that was soothing to me. I've now been to college twice and had other strange activity that did and did not include my angel. That can go for another time. And never forget that the young are always prone to see and hear what we cannot, because they are more open to the world than elders. It's not always an overactive imagination either. Thanks for reading. I've only had one paranormal experience. It happened last October when my boyfriend had temporarily rented a trailer. We had lived there for almost 2 months and nothing out of the ordinary had happened. One afternoon, he decided to take a nap and I was in the living room watching TV. I started hearing this really strange continuous screeching noise. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall beside his bedroom door. When I walked over there, it stopped. I sat back down and started watching TV again, and it started back again. This time, I walked into the kitchen. The bedroom was right beside the kitchen, and I started opening the bottom cabinets, and once again, the screeching stopped. I never said anything about it to my boyfriend because I didn't think a lot about it at the time. A couple of days later, we were in the kitchen eating breakfast, and he told me that the day before, when he was there by himself, that he heard a weird, loud screeching noise. He said he tried to find it where it was coming from, and it would not stop when he'd look. I told him that the same thing had happened to me while he was asleep a few days earlier. We both talked about ghosts and laughed about it, pretty much dismissing it as a joke. A few minutes later, his mom came and stayed all night and was asleep on the living room couch. This particular night, we were sleeping in the bedroom on the opposite end of the trailer. It was really late, probably around 3 a.m., and we had been laying there talking when I started hearing this noise. It was kind of like the screeching, but much quieter, and screeched at intervals, like footsteps. I thought my boyfriend had his hand dropped over the side of the bed, making that noise with his hand against the plastic on the mattress. I said, "Brian, quit making that noise." He said, "I'm not making that noise," and held up both of his hands. He looked at me as scared as I looked back at him and said, "Get up and get dressed." As soon as he said that, you could actually tell where the screeching was moving through the room to the corner beside the bed and feel this undescribable presence, and all of a sudden, the screeching just went crazy and so loud. It was right there. Needless to say, within a split second, it was the only one there. Now, can you imagine 2 grown adults running into the living room to wake up his mom? She said she hadn't heard anything, but that we scared her to death running through the living room at 3 a.m. in the morning like we were on fire. We sat up in the living room for the rest of the night and moved back to his mom's house within the week. So far, that's the only experience that I've had. I'm the only one in my family who believes in ghosts. I have plenty of reasons too. Many of these experiences I've never spoken of to anybody until now. My friends and family wouldn't believe me if I began to tell them, because I have so many different experiences with what I believe are ghosts. I think I'm meant to know of them. I feel like I have a connection with the dead. All of this probably sounds pretty unbelievable, especially coming from someone as young as I am, but it all happened. When I was very young, like maybe 3, I remember being watched. I remember shadows by the closet door. I think it was the shadow of a man. He watched me every night. Usually, he would just stand there. Once or twice, he would move towards me, and I ran into my parents' room, where they would let me stay. The shadow followed me into that room too, but I felt safe with my parents. For the next couple of years, I don't remember much. When I was 5, I lived on a farm in Nebraska. It was a really quiet area. I remember seeing a young woman, late teens, early 20s, running through the woods, laughing and giggling. If any of my experiences were to be blamed on my imagination, it would be this one. Though it was only my imagination, I don't understand how it appeared in my memory with such vivid detail. Later that year, I moved back to my home state, Virginia. Virginia is a pretty amazing state. It is one of the first places people came to when they discovered America, and it is also full of historical sites from both the Revolutionary War and Civil War, many battlefields and cemeteries. Anyway, when I first moved back there, my mother, my brother, and I were staying with my grandparents. It's a pretty old brick house. Before my grandparents moved into it, it was owned by my great aunt Clara. Ever since the first time I stepped into my grandma and grandpa's bedroom, I always get the chills. Even now, I dread going in there alone. When I was younger, the eyes of the picture of Aunt Clara would follow me. They would follow me across the room. My brother has always been just as scared of the room as I have. He would never tell anybody why. To this day, he refuses to go into the room. I remember the scariest was when I was 5. I was napping on Grandma's bed, and I was dreaming about Great Aunt Clara. All I remember about the dream was that she was wearing all black, and she was reaching out to me. I woke up sweating. The room was so dark, but I made out her figure standing at the front of the bed, reaching out to me like in a dream. I got up and ran out of the room, and into the dining room, where I was pushed headfirst into the leg of the large solid dining room table. I turned to see who had pushed me, and nobody was there. I had to go to the emergency room for stitches in my forehead. I never told anybody about seeing her because nobody would have believed me. Shortly after, we moved. Hi, I'm Phantom of Darkness, and I'm here to give you all your needs for this commercial. At Phantom of Darkness Enterprises, we offer a wide variety of selection of goods and goodies for you, including sharing this video, commenting, and liking and subscribing. If you're not totally satisfied with this offer, you may throw it in my face and tell me to go to hell. But if you don't do that, I will love you forever because I love you so much, guys. Woo! I don't know what I'm doing, guys. If you haven't noticed, this is a compilation of sorts, so you guys can listen to it while in the car, in the shower, eating your hairbrush, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what that means. At this point, I sucked all the funny out of my soul, and I'm not funny anymore, guys, so I think I just tried too hard. I'm just kidding. Man, I'm telling you guys, everybody needs a laugh now and then. Even after listening to scary stories, I think an outro is appropriate in this situation. But I'll see you guys later. See you in the next video. Good night, good morning. I love you guys, and I already said I'll see you in the next video, but Fanty Pants is here to stay. Bye-bye. By the way, don't hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section and let me know how you're doing, and I'll talk to you guys as usual. Whew, energy depleted successfully. Bye-bye.